Hi there, this is lesson 13, Under the Seafloor. Last time we looked at ocean profiles and how survey ships measured the profile or cross-section of the ocean floor and found that crazy ridge in the middle of the Atlantic. Around the same time or just before, a Croatian fellow was measuring earthquakes in Croatia. He was using seismographs at different stations, and a seismograph is just something that measures vibration or seismic waves in the crust. And it's one of those big drums of paper you see rolling over with a needle and pen on the end. And that's just recording, vibrations in the crust and different types of waves traveling as pressure waves or surface waves through the crust. So what he found was that the pattern of waves that were being received at these different stations, the only way they made sense is if there was a sort of interface underneath the continental crust, a place where there was a dramatic change in density of material, which corresponds, in essence, to the transition between sort of light, not very dense, brittle crust, and then where everything below that is slightly more molten or ductile. It's not fully molten, but it certainly is a little bit plastic in nature. So this boundary, and you can find it everywhere on Earth, is now known as the Mohorovičić discontinuity, or the MOHO for short. You find it in the oceans, you find it under continents. The depth changes according to where it occurs, but this boundary is found around the Earth. So this brings us to the idea of the seismic survey, the idea that you can glean information about density and different properties of rock by reading how seismic waves travel through the rock. And depending on the density of the rock, or whether it's ductile or brittle, the waves and how they're read by receiving stations will change. Basic seismic surveys took place, to start with, as a commercial enterprise. And the technique had been used for a long time in mapping petroleum geology. So this was since around World War I that seismic surveys had been used, but only in a commercial sense, and it wasn't used for anything of a scientific nature other than finding oil resources. By World War II, that was changing, and there were teams of survey ships sent out to do seismic surveys on the ocean floor to find out what, if anything, is underneath the ocean floor. And the way that would work is 2 ships would go out. One ship would be in a known location at a known time, and it would set off a seismic charge in the ocean, sort of a depth charge, an explosion. And you'd know exactly when and where that was set off. The other ship, the receiving station ship, would be 70 or so kilometers away, and it would receive the shock from this explosion. And it would receive it as a series of different waves. And how those waves travel through the earth and water can be figured out from what's received. The key principle at play here is refraction of waves in the earth. Just like, you remember we looked at Newton's prisms and how the boundary between gas or atmospheric air as a medium and a prism's glass as a medium. Remember how the light goes through and refracts based on the speed at which it travels through the medium? Anyway, that's how it works. And the same thing applies to seismic waves, pressure or surface waves through different densities of rock. And so whether the wave is traveling through unconsolidated sediments on the seafloor, or one layer of rock or molten rock, the reflections and refracted seismic waves will show up in the receiving station. And if you analyze it properly, you can actually tell how thick these layers are based on the time it takes for these reflections and refractions of the waves to occur. Using seismic surveys, we've learned a lot about the Earth's internal structure, the way that waves travel, what speed they travel, and how they refract throughout the Earth's internal boundaries. It tells us a lot about the density of rock, whether it's ductile, whether it's brittle. And so some of the main things we've gotten out of this are the fact that the ocean's crust is just a thin skim of very dense rock. It's only that 6 kilometers or 5 to 10 kilometers is the outskirts of that range. We can get the same sort of information about continental crust, which seems to be different than ocean crust. It's a lot less dense and it's a lot thicker. It's anywhere from 25 to 70 kilometers thick, at which point underneath you get the same Mohorovičić discontinuity, where you go from that brittle crustal rock to the lower ductile rock. And we know that because the density and therefore speed of waves changes and reflects off of this boundary. We're starting to get a decent picture of how the Earth is laid out geologically, at least at a general scale. The ocean floor has these weird features. It's incredibly uniform and thin. It has a strange cleft mountain range running down the middle of many of the oceans. We don't know what this means. Does it mean that the seafloor is spreading apart and pushing the continents around? And if so, how does that affect this theory of continental drift? There's something going on with the entire Earth's geology, but it's hard to tie it all together. So we'll have to go into a bit more depth and see how people looked into the issue further.